Welcome back. Now, following the release of the Matric results, broadcaster and political analyst Eusebius McKaiser has written an article highlighting the dangers of exceptional against all odds Matric stories. Now, McKaiser says that a collection of against all odds stories that are placed next to each other without structural analysis can actually send the false narrative that anyone can be brilliant if you just work hard enough and don't let your surroundings determine your fate. So Eusebius McKaiser joins us now to talk more about this. Eusebius, good morning, and thanks so much for being with us. And of course, let's just contextualize this. You are not by any means trying to take the shine away from the top achievers and the matriculants who really did perform exceptionally well.
Absolutely. Good morning to you, Sakina, and to the viewers. It's always a pleasure being on. The first thing I want to say is that the power of stories is something that you understand, Leanne understand, I understand. It's the bread and butter of good broadcasting. As journalists, we understand it. And then from a psychosocial point of view, they can also move others to really be better than they imagined they could be. If I see a story of someone from my community who had excelled against all odds, then I might begin to imagine that I'm not trapped in my community. There's also just the importance of acknowledging the brilliance of those who did so. I was one of those kids who worked extremely hard to be the first in my family, my immediate family, to finish high school and go to university. I was chuffed when the local newspaper in Grahamstown came to my school to snap some pictures and put it up. And there were youngsters in my street who were inspired to go to my school, Graham College, and also to do well. And many of them also ended up at Rhodes University. So the consequence of telling these stories are really important. We must celebrate the champagne that's been flowing in many households. It's beautiful. I was moved to tears last night watching SABC News with Flo introducing the top learners to the country, the minister speaking. How can you not when you see the parents on stage hugging their children? So I do not want to take away from that at all. But here's the analytical point that I have to make as a commentator and as a political analyst. Firstly, one danger, even if it's unintentional, is that you send the message to those children who are average that they did not work hard enough. They simply lacked willpower. And if they had worked hard enough, even if they don't have a science lab, a school library, they could have got an A for English, they could have got an A for science, they could have done better in maths, even though they didn't have a teacher for half the year. A second consequence is that you deflect from the political accountability of the state who let down hundreds of thousands of children by not ensuring that they have access to fair opportunity to also realize their potential. And we'll get into that, so I'll stop here. But those are the kinds of systemic consequences if you have a brochure of these beautiful stories, but they are not accompanied by hard-hitting structural analysis.
And I think obviously what flows from there is the accountability of the state, which we'll come to in just a moment. But obviously also this is a moment, I mean, after reading that article that you wrote, your contribution, it was a moment of reflection for me because perhaps as the media, we tend to go with the flow, as it were, in, you know, having all of these good news stories, these exceptional against all odds stories. I'm reminded yesterday at the breakfast, Minister Motshekga was talking about this young boy, one of the top achievers, who actually had to go to the police station and sit outside the police station to use the light emanating from the Apollo light, as she puts it, to study and had achieved, you know, these great results. But of course, we are also then, you know, seduced by these stories of exceptional human performance, these kids that against all the odds, as you say it, have persevered and they've attained these fantastic marks. But as the media, how do we then pull back slightly and not lose sight of what about all the other children, those who did not have the wherewithal? What about a girl child for whom perhaps it wasn't as safe to go out at night and sit under the lights because you don't know how far they have to go or what they have to contend with?
Sakina, I get goosebumps by that example because that example draws us in both as media, because we are human before we are journalists, but also for the public. But the way we have to rein ourselves in is to say to ourselves as analysts, as well as news editors, and also just as a reporter in that venue, we have a role to hold the government accountable. The second, even if it's not the first question you ask my Angie, when the Q&As then opened up after these announcements of these feats of against all odds stories, is, Minister, should you not, after you have lauded the student, look the nation in the eye wherever the camera is you're told to look into, and apologize for the fact that that child has to overcome structural violence, energy insecurity, risk their physical person to go to a police station and to go and study under those conditions? Because the very same facts that are a basis to inspire us are a good reason for my Angie to resign as Minister of Basic Education, and for her entire cabinet to take collective responsibility for why, for example, 440,000 students that started grade 11 in 2011 never finished last year and are not even part of the calculus. Which is why, in response to Leanne's question for the viewers, that 80+% pass rate is deceptive. We have literally lost hundreds of thousands of students in the system. What happened to them? What happened to those students who fail key subjects that are determinants of future success, such as maths and science, because they didn't have a lab or a qualified teacher in their schooling system? We have to remind ourselves as the media that those critical questions must be put to government side by side with a splash of those matrics who managed to walk to a police station and to do so. Take the girl child that you're talking about. She suffers many vulnerabilities. Not only is there the increased risk in terms of GBV that she could be raped on her way to the police station, we also, Sakina, have hundreds of thousands of girl children, teenagers who menstruate in South Africa, who lose out on school days because this government, despite having a woman in charge of basic education, doesn't make freely available sanitary towels, pads, or tampons to these young women to be able to go to school, which is also why you have inequity between boys and girls, even though a bigger share of those who wrote matric might be girls nominally. They end up performing worse, in part because they lose out on school days, because they don't have access, for example, to a pad or to sanitation in other forms. Those are the kinds of structural, when I say structural analysis, it's an unnecessary theoretical framework, but those are the practical things that are missing in our system that account for why overall the class of 2022, like the year before, has been done an injustice. But when you are on stage, you can deflect from political accountability by inducing tiers of stories about against all odds accomplishments.
And then, of course, there's the issue of the inevitable comparisons between the results attained by these learners in the public schools against those who wrote the IEB exam. And again, we're not even going to get into that because that's a long story for another day. But in terms of continuing the reflection, Eusebius, there is, of course, also a question that I have in terms of if we are now cognizant of the danger of this narrative, the danger of these exceptional against all odds stories and just going with them wholesale. Should we be reflecting then the stories of those children who haven't done as well, those children who are really struggling? Do you think that we perhaps should be putting those two stories side by side so as to perhaps establish, common ground for most learners as opposed to only a certain cohort?
That's such a beautiful question for society at large, but also in general, if you are in the business of crafting stories from a media point of view. There's an academic from my alma mater who made I thought, a really good point on my social media pages and suggested that from a role modeling impact point of view, Sakina, stories about average people making great strides to go from average to performing well above average could be more realistic in terms of inspiring the child that doesn't have the innate capacity to get 100% for maths. And what he meant in practical terms, it reminded me of, for example, awards that we might have at the prize-giving awards at schools, where you give an award for endeavor or for the most improved scholar. The child who goes from 45% at the beginning of the academic year and ends up with 65% could be an inspiration to a bigger numerical majority of classmates than a Sakina who always gets 90% because she's just sheer brilliance. And again, we have the weekend ahead of us. The Sunday papers have an opportunity to get it right. They can still contextualize. They can still juxtapose the accountability questions with the against all odds stories. And they can go and find those students who may be in grade 8 were C students that are now B students, or who were failing and managed to end up with 65%. Their story of how they did it may have a better, in terms of magnitude, inspirational impact than simply trotting out the stories of everyone who got straight A's.
Eusebius, thank you so much for bringing that perspective to the fore as well. I think it's an important one. We'll leave it there and we'll wait and see if this actually gets reflected. But thank you so much. That was
Thanks
Eusebius McKaiser, broadcaster, analyst and contributor at Times Live, speaking to us about the exceptional against all odds stories and whether we should be more reflective of how we actually tell these stories.